Our next speaker is Julien Voyon from the University of Montreal, and we will be talking about neural and physiological correlates of motor memory and learning and consolidation.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and especially Avi as well, and Shelley, who's done a great job. I did not have the chance to meet Dr. Vesnitz, but obviously she had a major impact in the field, and so I'm very happy to be here and honored actually to be part of this symposium. So what I'd like to do in the next 30 minutes is to give you an overview of some of the work that we've been doing looking at motor learning in particular. So Ellie did a great job in terms of being able to differentiate between declarative and procedural memory. But in my case, in my talk, I'll be focusing on motor learning in particular, one form actually of procedural memory. So let me first define what we mean by procedural memory or motor learning, which refers to the process of improving smoothness and accuracy of movements through practice, and it's resulting in long-lasting changes in the capability for responding. Okay, actually. Is that better? Oh yeah, it must be much better, right? Now you can hear me, okay. So obviously one would like to be able to look at all of those complex movements, especially in this kind of when you're interested in looking at the substrates, observing those kind of skills, but it's not possible, as you know. And so the two type of tasks that we've been using in my lab are the following. One is one that's been described already by Ellie, which is a version actually of the work that based on the sequence task or finger position sequence task that Avi Kani has been using for many years. And this is a task where we ask the subject to press a button corresponding to a sequence that in this particular case, the sequence will be known to the subject explicitly before they get into the scanner. So basically the kind of learning we'll be looking at is, for example, when you're trying to play guitar for the first time. First time you try to really have to pay attention to where you're going to put your fingers on the chord to make an accord, but however, with practice it becomes implicit, it becomes automatic. So that's the kind of learning we'll be looking at here with this kind of task. The other kind of also measures or kind of learning that one can look at is this adaptation task, where basically now what we're asking to do as subject is to use a joystick that controls a cursor on the screen, and the subject has to follow the curved line and reach the target within a particular time period. However, what we've done is basically inverse the x and y coordinates of the joystick, so that now to be able to reach this target, subject has to do this movement here. And this is so an adaptation to sensory motor matching that is completely different from what we're used to, for example, when we use the mouse. And as you will see, these two types of learning, this type of motor learning will be used in different systems anyway for the maintenance of this kind of building. So we know that this type of learning, okay. So we know that this type of learning can be conceptualized as the acquisition of a specific motor plan for the effective performance of the intended action. We know that the acquisition is incremental in nature with practice, can be measured in different ways, as Ellie illustrated very clearly, can be acquired either explicitly or implicitly, and as I told you, in this case, the subject will know the sequence explicitly before they get into the scanner. The retrieval is implicit, so you don't need to really pay attention to what you've learned, but you're able to do it. It's like when you play tennis or you play golf, you don't think necessarily about the movements, and you just do the movements. We know that this kind of learning is also long-lasting, and does not depend on limbic structures, on the middle temporal structures that are so important for the declarative memory, where when we have lesions, you produce amnesia. However, based on a lot of work that we have done, based on animal work as well, other labs as well around the world, we now know that there are two other systems that will be critical for learning and maintaining this type of skill. And so to give you an example of the kind of work that we did, so in this study that was published in 2005, we had 14 subjects, and we basically were trying to look at different phases of the learning process. In the first early learning phase, where you see a lot of improvement in performance during the first session that Andy has shown, but also trying to see what happens when subjects are now practicing for 14 days, 15 to 20 minutes per day over a period of 14 days, and again at day 28 after another 14 days of practice. So at that point here, subjects will be pretty much, and not completely automatized on the task, but very well practiced. And so in this design, we use a block design where we ask subjects to do the task, and then we had a rest period, and we had those 5 sessions here. The reason why we had 3 sessions in the day 1 is because we wanted to look at the dynamic changes that occurs during that first period of learning. And when you do that, what you're looking at here are T1 to T2, T3 are day 1, and T5 is 28 days of practice. And as you can see, either on the left side and on the right side, the movements were done with the left hand, so it makes sense that we have more activity on the right side. What you're looking at here is a coronal sections at the level of the putamen, the basal ganglia. And so what we found is that as we expected, we had activity in the basal ganglia, what we call here the associative region of the putamen. And also with learning, you can see that there was a switch of activity within the putamen in the sensory motor region of the putamen here. And that region was again activated at T5, which means after 28 days of practice. However, when you look at the cerebellum, you see a different pattern of activity here. First, in T1, you see that the cerebellum beginning of learning is very much implicated, suggesting that both the cortical-striatal system and the cortical-cerebellar systems are involved in the beginning of the learning process. But after a lot of practice, which is 28 days of practice, you see the activity in the cerebellum that decreases drastically, and that's at the level of the dentate nucleus. Suggesting here that at the beginning, as I said, these two systems, cortical-striatal and cortical-cerebellar systems, will be implicated to develop the motor program necessary to do the task. But for sequence learning, because the basal ganglia is better equipped to do the task, this is the area that we're maintaining the skill. Okay? Now, what happens with adaptation? Do we see a different pattern of results? And so in this study that we published in 2009, we had 1 day of scanning, the first day of practice on the adaptation task that I mentioned before. And here we had another period of practice and we subject-level approach where we made sure the subject would reach symptomatic performance at the end of the practice here. And it takes about 24 days to reach that level of practice on average for each subject, so that after we scan the subject again when they had to reach asymptotic performance, when they have some kind of automatization of the task. And so here, when you're looking at the inverse condition versus the direct condition, where there is no inverse of the joystick, that's the control task, you can see that there was activity in the basal ganglia at the beginning of learning. However, at the end of learning, when the subject has well practiced the task, you can see that there is now activity in the cerebellum and cortical regions related to the cerebellum, suggesting that now for this kind of a task, for this kind of motor skill, there's another system that will be involved in maintaining this kind of ability. And so, based on this kind of work, and others as well, we have proposed a model quite a few years ago now, and that model doesn't explain everything, obviously not, but it's been very useful for us to try to come up with hypotheses and expectations of what one could see for the dynamic changes that occurs during motor learning. And so the model goes like this. So for motor sequence learning and motor adaptation, during the fast learning phase, And depending on the cognitive processes that are required during the task, I'm describing only two versions of model learning, sequence learning adaptations, but there are others as well. So at the beginning of learning, what you're going to see is the following. The motor cortical regions are going to be activated, going to be part of the equation. Parietal cortices, frontal assistive region as well are going to be activated, and the medial temporal lobe, even the hippocampus, and you'll see a talk after me with Geneviève Albouy showing you how the hippocampus plays a role in the, not only in the learning, but also in the consolidation of this type of ability. But also one can see some kind of switch or transfer of activity even within the striatum or the cerebellum. As I told you here, the switch from the associative to the sensory motor region of the striatum, and in the cerebellar cortex, the cerebellar cortex nuclei as well. We have shown that, and other people like Paul Matthews have shown that as well. So basically what we think is that at the beginning of learning, the brain doesn't know how to do the task properly. So it's going to put all resources necessary to be able to do this. However, because one system is better equipped than the other to do one type of learning, then this one will be more evident for maintaining this kind of ability. And so the model suggests then that during the slow learning phase, you start to see some kind of dissociations, as I showed you. So that for sequence learning, you have now a more cortical striatal systems that will be more important for learning and continuing learning this kind of skill. Whereas for adaptation, it will be a more cortical cerebellar system. So that after automatization, when the task is completely well practiced and well automatized, then you start to see complete dissociation between these two systems. And at retention, one would expect that even if you have not practiced this task, but you're being asked to do it again like a week or months later, then that these two systems will be necessary to again reproduce the movements. However, this is not the end of the story, because these two systems will be involved in the program, building up the program, the command to do the movements, and helping us to be able to do smooth movements. However, between the command and the muscle, there is another structure that is important. And we recently discovered that the spinal cord is also playing a role in motor sequence learning. And this is a study where it was done by two postdoc Madab, Chad Fadat and Oviju Longu. And we basically again compare a complex sequence. This time, sequence again was known explicitly. It was a 5-item sequence. And we compared this to simple movements like this. Okay? And we had 12 blocks of practice, 23 subjects. And when you compare the performance of these two groups, for the complex sequence, the 5-item sequence, compared to the simple sequence, you see there has been greater improvement or learning in the complex sequence compared to the simple. And when you compare these two conditions, and you use a very special sequence, pulse sequence with the MR, to be able to look not only at the brain but also the spine, when you compare these two conditions, you see that there's activity here in the C6, C8 region of the spine. And when you do modulations now of the activity with performance, so you're asking the question, what are the voxels in the brain and the spinal cord that are correlating with the activity that one can see with the Bose signal? You can see that we have again those regions that are the usual suspect with the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and motor regions that are activated at the brain level, but also activity in the spinal cord. So we are very excited about this new finding and trying now to understand what is really the relationship between the brain and the spinal cord and how they play together to learn new skills. So now that we have a better idea of what are the regions and the neural substrates involved in the learning process, we know that once a skill has been acquired, the memory trace of that skill will be reprocessed again and to be consolidated so that it will produce an enduring state. And using this task again, there's been a lot of evidence, and first shown by Arvikani's group here, that there's one particular state that seems to be important for the consolidation of this kind of learning. And the state is sleep. And as one first study, for example, looking at the effect of sleep in the consolidation process of this type of ability by Maya Coleman, who's here today, where basically here what they ask subject to do is, in each time point, is 30 seconds. So they're basically asking the subject to do as many sequence of movement, 5-item sequence, they can do in 30 seconds. And so you see the performance before training here, and after a period of training where they did 160 repetition of the sequence. And then you can see here that after training, in the post-training phase, the subject had improved better performance. But what's more interesting is that they had two groups. One group slept after the post-training phase, and as you can see, there was spontaneous gains in performance, suggesting some kind of consolidation process occurring during sleep. And then when it was tested 24 hours, the performance was the same. Whereas if you compare to a group that did not sleep between the post-training and the 12-hour post-training phase, then you don't see any improvement. Suggesting that here that sleep can play some kind of role in the consolidation process. This has been replicated by Betsy Walker. Again, you present the sequence at 10 p.m. and that's the subject, you retest the subject after a night of sleep, you see a major improvement in performance. Whereas if you test the subject at 10 p.m., if you present the sequence here at 10 a.m. and then ask the subject to do the sequence again at 10 p.m., you don't see any improvement. Suggesting that sleep will be involved in this process. We've shown also the same thing in 2009. So it's a well-known finding. The one thing also that we found in 2009 is that, or 2008 in another study, sorry, is that there was something else also happening during the night that seems to be particularly changed and related to the learning process. And this is related to the spindles. So here you can see the total number of sleep spindles and the duration. And if you look at the two different phases of the night, we showed that there was an increase of the total number of spindles and the durations in the three phases of the night for the sequence learning versus the control task. And this is something that the literature is showing that spindles are important, that might be involved in the consolidation process, but there's no clear evidence of this, and this is something that in the lab we've been trying to focus more. And so here you have the characteristics of the spindles. We know that there are bursts of activity between 10 and 16 Hz, characterized with stage 2 and 3. They're quite stable from one night to the next, but they show large individual differences. They're believed to be generated by reticular thalamic neurons and propagated in the thalamocortical loop. And there's also evidence that they relate to synaptic changes and long-term potentiation. That makes sense then that these spindles might be contributing to the consolidation process. So if it is true that spindles are critical during the night for the consolidation, one should see a really clear relationship between the spindles and reactivation of the trace during the night. And so to be able to test this hypothesis, this is a study that was done by Stuart Fogel, a postdoc in my lab, where we basically then ask the subject to learn a sequence of movement. And now what we're going to do is put the subject into the scanner while they're sleeping, and we're going to record both EEG and fMRI at the same time while they're sleeping, and then we're going to retest the subject the next day. And so here in this study, we had a 5-item sequence again, was 12 sequences per block and was 60 movements per block, and so we had 14 blocks of practice, and then for the training phase, and 14 blocks also in the retest the next day. We compared this in the same subject, so it was a within subject design. So we had a here a control task will simply ask the subject to produce movements like this for periods of time. So we had 14 blocks again with this kind of control movements, and for the training, and also 14 blocks for the retest. Here the design. First we had an adaptation night where we asked the subject to be in the mock scanner to make sure they will be able to sleep in this kind of environment. It's not necessarily easy to do, and to find subjects that will be able to sleep in this scanner. But then on the first day, we then trained the subject and did the 14 blocks, practice around 10:30 in the evening, and then simply asked the subject to sleep in the scanner. And we record, as I said, both EEG and fMRI, both signal. Then we asked subject to, after they finished, and they were able to sleep all the way to max 2 hours and 40 minutes, but most subjects did not sleep 2 hours and 40 minutes, as you can expect. But then we bring the subject to the lab, we do polysynaptic recordings, and then we test the subject again the next morning. If you do that, you see the performance for the sequence learning task with the subject, and when you look at the performance in the retest, you see that there is major improvement in performance, again suggesting at the behavioral level there has been consolidation on this kind of learning, compared to the control task where there is absolutely no improvement in performance at all. What is more interesting, however, is that when you look at the brain, we would expect that basically the areas or the brain regions that are involved in the learning should be reactivated during the night and related to spindles, right? So when you record EEG in the scanner, this is what it looks like, EEG looks like at first. So when you do the corrections for both the gradient artifacts and the cardioballistic artifacts, then you're able to look at EEG. And you can even identify spindles and slow waves. And basically what we're now going to do is use those spindles as events and try to correlate both signals that are related to those events during the night. Okay? So here is what I'm showing you is during the training phase. As you can see again, we see the usual suspect, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, even the hippocampus here is involved as well, premotor cortex and parietal cortex. Those same regions are always activated during the early phase of learning. This is after retest. You can see again those same regions, and even the putamen is even more activated after a night of sleep, as one would expect. And here are the regions that are activated, that are time locked to the spindles. And here we're using the spindles for the PZ and CZ electrodes only, that are 0.5 seconds and more. And what we've done here is we did a comparison between the sequence versus the control, and these are the regions you see here are regressed with gains, so they're showing a relationship with gains of performance the next day. And so, as we expected, you see reactivation of, again, the cerebellum, the hippocampus, premotor regions, even the SMA regions. We didn't see any activity in the putamen, but we have other data showing that the putamen also seems to be reactivated during the night, but not really necessarily related to spindles. So this shows actually that spindles might be actually a very important feature of the sleep, where you see reactivation of the trace and involved in the consolidation process and showing better performance the next day. So, but this is again very correlational, because what we've done here is do a correlation between spindles and ball signal. So if spindles are really critical for the consolidation process of a motor sequence learning task, if you modulate the spindles, you should also be able to modulate consolidation. And so to be able to do this and to test this hypothesis, we use this kind of design. Now we're going to do conditioning of the sequence task. So while they're learning the sequence, what we're going to do is present an olfactory stimulus. And we're going to present, while subjects are sleeping, the olfactory stimulus. either in stage 2 or in the REM sleep stage, and compare the performance the next day after stimulation. And our hypothesis is that if we present the olfactory stimulus in stage 2, where you see most of the spindles appearing, okay, this should help reactivating the trace and producing better performance the next day. Okay? And so here the design, we had a group where we did the conditioning on the order and the sequence task, and during the night, and I mentioned here that this is critical, we did the stimulation, olfactory stimulation, in the second phase of the night. So first, to be able to compare the same period of the night for both non-REM and the REM period, but also to have some kind of baseline here. So we'll be able to use spindle activity that occurs without stimulation and with stimulation. And as you will see, this is going to be very important. So the first group, we presented olfactory stimulus during the REM sleep period, stage 2 in particular, non-REM, I'm sorry. And we had another group where we did also the conditioning, but presented the olfactory stimulus during the REM period. And just to make sure that olfactory stimulation itself did not produce any changes in the memory trace, what we did is we had another group that we did not do any conditioning, but presented the olfactory stimulus in stage 2 sleep. The stimulation was done in a period of 30 seconds with 1 second of puff that were presented to the subject while they were sleeping, and a 2 seconds of rest with no puff, so that there was no adaptation to the odor, and a period of 30 seconds on and off. And first thing we need to test is that the subjects when we presented the olfactory stimulus, it was done in a good stage. So here for the stage 2, you can see that the subject, we presented the olfactory stimulus in that stage mainly. Here is for the control group, and here's for the REM group. So we know that we did the right stimulation, the right phase as we expected. Here's the performance, the behavioral performance we can see. First of all, for the control group, those who we did not do any conditioning, you see that there is improvement in performance, and that is expected because they had a night of sleep. But as we predicted, when you present the olfactory stimulus in conditioned group in the non-REM 2, you see the major improvement in performance compared to the control and also compared to the REM phase, suggesting again that now this period of the night, the non-REM 2, where we see most of the spindles, is also critical for the consolidation process. And as I told you, one thing we did also is that we were able to compare the activity, spindle activity here during the stimulation versus a pre-match period where there was no stimulation. And when you do that, we saw that there was an increase in amplitude, frequency, and duration, and as well as spindle activity in the conditioned non-REM 2 compared to the control group. And one thing that is interesting is that the frequency, the change in frequency after stimulation seems to be critical, because as you can see there was a drop in the slow spindles and an increase in the fast spindles during the conditioned group. And this frequency, if you do mediation analysis, could explain actually the difference that we saw between the groups in the gains in performance. So what are the take-home messages? First, that both corticostriatal and corticocerebellar systems contribute to the generation of memory trace during motor sequence learning and adaptation as well. That the spinal cord, don't forget the spinal cord, it also seems to be contributing to this kind of learning. Sleep contributes to the consolidation process and the sequence of movements. The spindles in particular in non-REM 2 are associated with reactivation of the similar regions that are involved in the learning process. And when you modulate the spindles with olfactory stimulation or other type of stimulation, you can produce even better performance. So based on this, I'd like to thank the people who did the work in my lab and good collaborators, Judy Kari, for example, Avi Carney, who's been involved in many of the studies we've been doing so far, and also some other colleagues I had the pleasure to work with, and obviously the agencies that have funded this kind of work. Thank you so much.
Question?
I've always learned that memory consolidation is related to REM sleep. Now I'm just hearing that it's during spindling during stage 2.
Yeah. Actually,
What's the new in this story? Because in my head it was always REM sleep, and now it's stage 2, and we have always thought that something.
okay, so Avi is going to talk about this, but basically, it's true that some people were showing previously that the REM might be involved in model learning. But if you look again, if you look at what Eli told us, it depends on the kind of task that was used. In those tasks, it was a probabilistic sequence learning task. It was very much cognitive in nature. And it's not necessarily motor learning that one tests with this kind of paradigm. And so when you use this kind of more cognitive related task, it seems like the REM might be more critical. But if you look at sequence, the motor component aspect of sequence learning, it seems now there's quite a bit of evidence. And with the work that I've shown you, I hope that I convince you that it's more related to non-REM and spindle in particular.
Is there any evidence that perturbation of stage 2 sleep might really affect this kind of memory consolidation?
Yeah, there's some evidence actually that if you perturb the non-REM, that you're going to have deficit in the consolidation process as well. And if you do it for the REM, you don't necessarily have this kind of deficit on the consolidation.
Okay, last question.
Yeah.
You said that you use spindles as event to analyze.
Yeah.
Is there a way to apply source localization there to see whatever going there in terms of source activity based on EEG?
Yeah. So I missed the question.
Yeah, is there a way to apply source localization on spindles as events?
Absolutely. We're doing that actually.
Yeah.
And I could show you the results where we have been looking at source localization using EEG. So those regions that are activated again during the night, and we can see only the parietal cortex and the premotor regions. And here what we're showing with this, with EEG, is that it's not all spindles that are involved in the reactivation of the trace. It seems like only spindles that are 0.5 seconds in duration and more are the ones that are going to be involved in reactivating the trace. And also that the amplitude, those that have higher amplitude and higher frequency, as I showed here as well, that will be involved in reactivation. So it's not all spindles that will be contributing to the consolidation process necessarily. So we're showing that as well, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice.
I have a question referring to the function and the occurrence of spindles in infancy, because if it's similar, then the implication for co-sleeping or sleeping in a quiet, separate room as opposed to sleeping in a natural environment are very, very significant. Do you know of any work that is done along these lines?
Not to my knowledge, no. But I think this is a very good. This is something that should be studied absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is about there is a takeover of one region in the brain once it automatized from an area that was very active before that. Right? In your slides, you showed that change in the way where the brain does the same kind of thing. Do you have evidence or do you have speculations about this process being more abrupt, up to a point it is happening here and then it moves somewhere, but there's kind of a time in between where both are activated. So that's question number one.
Okay, well, let me try to answer that one, okay? What we see during model learning is really that these two systems are activated. And then, as I said, because of specialization of one system versus the other, then you're going to see some kind of dissociations between the two. Within that, there's also some regions that will be involved at the beginning, for example, let's say A, B, C, D, E, okay? But then, when it's well practiced, then you're going to see some regions that are not necessarily activated anymore. Again, with this efficient hypothesis we were talking about yesterday, we see that as well. For example, those who have the frontal cortex, very much activated at the beginning sometimes, depending on the kind of task. But because it's become automatic, then the cognitive aspect becomes less important, and then you don't see it. Okay? So does that answer your question?
So if I understand what you're saying, the areas that are initially activated kind of decrease activation over time.
It's not that it will decrease activation, it's just some regions will drop, okay? But there's going to be specialization. But it's true that at the beginning of the learning process, the brain is giving everything that it has to try to do the task, okay? And actually I think, and we have some evidence to show that there's even competition between these two systems at the beginning. That even if you, for example, in Parkinson's disease, okay, with basal ganglia dysfunction, you're going to see much more activity in the cerebellum in those patients. Why? Because they're compensating to that system, you see?
The second question has to do, it's also related to what Eli presented earlier. The task with the fingers seem to require to have a different goal than, for example, if you try to shoot a tennis ball versus if you try to shoot a free throw in basketball. And it seems to be different at the level of the goal as well as what needs to be learned. So do you think that some of the work that you're doing with those finger things would appear also in very different goals, or you think that you would have to study different aspects of learning depending on what the goal of the motion is?
The goal will dictate what the brain has to do, okay, to be able to produce a task, of course. If there is any kind of sequential aspect, for example, the basketball, right? So that kind of movement is a sequential aspect as well. I think that you'll see the corticostriatal system being involved not only in the learning but also in the maintenance of that ability, much more than this. It doesn't mean that cerebellum is not activated, not at all. Just that the representation itself of the movement is more related to the corticostriatal system. Okay? So that's. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.